Hello and good morning and welcome. My name is Kara Marsh-Prophet and I am the Director of Alumni Operations and Engagement for USD's Office of Alumni Relations. And I am thrilled to have you with us today for our first session of the Alumni Association's program, Living into Inclusion, a DEI and A series for alumni. Today's session is presented by the University of San Diego's Alumni Board of Directors, a distinguished group of alumni volunteer leaders. The mission of the USD Alumni Association and its Board of Directors is to engage and enrich the Torero community for life. Today's program is rooted in the desire to offer meaningful ways for our community to stay in touch and learn from one another. We know how strong our USD network is and hope these types of virtual opportunities will continue to strengthen the connection while bringing value to our lives. Today's session falls within the season of Lent. As a faith-based institution rooted in the Catholic faith and tradition, we are proud to offer sessions on diversity, equity, inclusion, and access as an opportunity for learning and reflection. A few housekeeping items before I pass off the microphone. We are using Zoom webinar today. The Q&A feature has been activated for you to pose questions you may have for our facilitator and presenter throughout the session. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature as we go through. Q&A will be answered at the end. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Alumni Association's YouTube channel next week. I will send a follow-up message to all registered attendees with a link to the recording. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's facilitator, Amanda Corona, who will be introducing our featured speaker and conducting today's interview. Amanda Corona is a USD School of Leadership and Education Sciences alumna, having received her master's in nonprofit leadership in 2018. Additionally, Amanda is a member of the USD Alumni Association Board of Directors, where she serves as an inaugural chair for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. Amanda, I invite you to turn on your camera. There you are. Before I pass it off to you, I'd like to personally thank you for your leadership as part of the Alumni Board and chair of its DEI Task Force. You are a true blue Torero, and your efforts to build this program are recognized and appreciated truly more than you know. All of us at USD are grateful for you, and from one alumna to another, one Torero to another, I'm grateful to call you my friend. Take it away.
Thank you, Kara. It's definitely an honor to be here, and I'm super excited for this series. As Kara mentioned, I'm not only an alumna, but also serve on the Alumni Board, and the DEI Task Force is in its inaugural year, and we're really excited to be able to, in alignment with the mission of the university, educate each other, grow with each other, and advance in our DEI efforts. So allow me to introduce our presenter today, Conor McLaughlin. He, they, series pronouns, serves as the Staff Learning and Development Specialist in the Center for Inclusive Excellence at San Diego State University. Conor was previously a teaching professor at Bowling Green State University in the Department of Higher Education and Student Affairs. Conor has also worked at University of San Diego in the Center for Inclusion and Diversity, UC San Diego in the Division of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and in residence life at San Diego State University, Cornell University, and Columbia University. Conor holds a PhD in Leadership Studies from the University of San Diego School of Leadership and Education Sciences, where their dissertation explored the use of bell hooks teaching to transgress as a conduit for shifting approaches to leadership and professional practice in student affairs professionals who are white, heterosexual men. Conor has published research on approaches to social justice and leadership, practicing adaptive leadership, supporting LGBTQ students of color on college campuses, and the ways student affairs professionals navigate experiencing unemployment. Conor also holds an MA in Organizational Leadership from Teachers College, Columbia University, and a BA in Philosophy from Cabrini College, now Cabrini University. Conor enjoys coffee, photography, music, and cooking as pathways to building community. Conor, I invite you to turn on your camera.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Wonderful. And let's get right into it. We've got a short lunch break to take advantage of. So Connor, tell us a little bit about you. I know I just read off your bio and your credentials and your background, but I'd love to hear it in your words. What do you do and how does diversity, equity, and inclusion fit into your work?
Certainly. So I have the distinct privilege of being the first person to serve in my particular role as the staff learning and development specialist at San Diego State University. I work in the Center for Inclusive Excellence, which is housed in the Office of Faculty and Staff Diversity within the Division of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity. So given all of the titles that I just shared, equity, diversity, and inclusion is pretty central to everything that I do. And my work is to really focus in on creating opportunities for staff to pursue their own professional learning and development within equitable systems and to create pathways to more equitable practice within staff learning and development. So there's a constant balance of that we're always trying to strike that looks at both how are staff able to access professional development that aligns with their wants and needs for their career, and in what ways is equity central to questions of how staff pursue professional development. So, always examining the ways in which power and resources are distributed in ways that are informed by gatekeeping, by systems of power, and in ways that ultimately lead to inequitably distributed outcomes for staff, and what are the ways that we can realign our organization, realign our resources, and realign our approaches that are more equitable and more just.
Thank you. And for me, I find that it's helpful to understand the background behind the journey. And that lends itself to my anthropology undergraduate background and my ethnographic research. And I just want to know more about you. So can you describe your journey getting to this part of your career as it relates to DEI?
Certainly. Well, I think so much of how I got here has been sort of a very evolutionary journey, in that every time I think I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing, I realize that there's something that's shifting in me that sort of pulls me to the next thing. So started out working in residence life, as many people in the world of student affairs do, and found that while I loved everything about my job, the thing that I found myself thinking about most often and wanting to spend more and more of my time on was doing training and professional development. And at first I thought it was just student staff. I wanted to focus on doing student staff training, ongoing learning. And so over the course of my time in residence life, I started to focus more and more on doing that work, to getting to the point where it took up pretty much the entirety of my year, because we would be planning for onboarding, and then we would be planning for summer training, and then we would be planning, our ongoing series, and then we'd have to start getting ready for January when everybody comes back. So when I moved over into sort of working in an EDI division, that was sort of very much my central focus. And when I came to USD and sort of decided to pursue my PhD and started to think about moving into the faculty realm, I was still thinking a lot about how teaching can also be in service of this. And so that informed a lot of how I approached my teaching and my involvement in my service when I was at Bowling Green State. And how I got to my current job really came out of my experience as a faculty member, because I would like to think having at least a moderate impact on a new generation of student affairs professionals, and was constantly observing that these new professionals were encountering systems that weren't necessarily prioritizing justice. And this is not a commentary on a particular institution. This is, they sort of leave their graduate preparation programs, go out into the field, and struggle with institutions that are not receptive to their approaches, that are not necessarily that are saying they are committed to justice, and also continuing to run into the roadblocks that inevitably exist when organizational change efforts are trying to be initiated. And so when an opportunity to work within a university and to work with staff at all levels, because my sort of my constituents, or my, the targets of my work are everybody who has a staff designation at this university. So I work with our custodial staff, I work with our university police department, I work with our hall directors, I work with our admissions counselors, and I work with directors of divisions and associate vice presidents of entire areas. So the opportunity to work at the systemic level and to sort of be an agent of change within a system sounded like a fantastic evolution of what I felt like I had been working towards my entire career. And so sort of every job I came into, it wasn't that I was trying to leave immediately as soon as I got there, but at some point something would click for me and I would say, oh, so I think the next thing is this evolved version of what drew me to the job I have now. And that has usually been the indicator for me of, helping me define sort of what's next on this journey.
You mentioned many things that I want to definitely touch on. One of which is, I think many of us on this call can agree or have experience in the work setting, whether higher education, for-profit, nonprofit, what have you. There can become a cyclical effect where you're just going event after event, meeting after meeting, project after project, and you don't often have the time to stop and reflect. I know that Seoul's School of Leadership and Education Sciences at USD, a big premise of that program is that pause, that reflect, the reconcile, the make sure that everything is aligned. So that's one piece I wanted to acknowledge. And the second piece, which I think is very important, was the part of the non-linear path. And the fact that your path wasn't necessarily laid out in your mind on a map, on a vision board, but you allowed there to be space to experience, to grow, to utilize your skills, and then identify what the next right step is for you. I would love to hear more about your experience at USD in the PhD program and how that has lent to the way you react or the way you encourage or train people when they experience that, where they get into an organization and the values may not actually align with the actions of the organization. What did you learn at USD, and how might that be related to our audience?
I think so much of how I have come to understand like why my life is the way that it is due to what I learned at USD. If you had talked to me in 2012, before I came to USD and before I began engaging with the PhD program in leadership studies, I probably would have just said, I don't know, the world is utter chaos and I'm just trying to exist within it. And I still sort of generally think that way. The world is a pretty random and chaotic place. And Souls and the leadership studies department taught me a lot about presence and a lot about sort of being receptive to the present moment. And I think that has helped me both to make sense of a lot of my own experiences and also to operate in a way that is just sort of very present and attuned to what is going on and what needs are. I can't really adjust my camera because I'd be worried about dropping my computer, and that would be bad for a couple of reasons. But I have a large whiteboard in my office, and sort of a permanent fixture on that are some visual representations of some of the theories that I learned in my time at USD. And I have little red, I drew them in a black marker, and then in red, I've noted where I think I am in different processes. So as I said before, I'm the first person to have the job that I currently have. And so I've left myself a reminder that probably for the next little while, at least the rest of this academic year, a lot of my job needs to be taking inventory, needs to be listening to what has already been happening, needs to be learning about the university, needs to be learning about the system, because it can be very easy to sort of be a new person and to want to jump in with 1,000 new ideas and start to tell everybody everything that they need to be doing differently right away. So, and that was very much how I operated in my career for a very long time. And Souls taught me the value of sort of pausing, listening, taking inventory, and really practicing a higher level of discernment in order to not just try to come in and change everything, but also to find ways to lift up the folks who have already been doing the good work, to identify what that good work has been, and not try to sort of reinvent things in my own way, but rather to sort of make space for good work, to sort of maybe find avenues, find spaces that it might not have had previously. And so, I have this constant reminder that I look at every day that is, just remember to listen, remember you're still taking inventory, remember you need to keep learning, rather than sort of just apply what you already know to a place that you don't necessarily know yet how it fits well. So that is absolutely something that I learned in Souls, and a lesson that still informs every day the way that I operate. I also think that Souls presented me with a really fantastic opportunity to learn a whole lot more about me. What does it mean to embody the identities that I do? What are the ways that being, white, heterosexual, cisgender man shapes my understanding of leaderships, shapes my expectations of leadership? And I don't know that I I certainly came to realizations and insights about those things. And so those insights are also part of what prompted me to need to step back, to not always assume that I know better than everybody, or that I am sort of the be all end all authority or expert on the topic, but that Souls taught me to find the place where my voice is needed, and to know when my voice isn't what is needed in a situation. And while I would love to say that I now get it right all the time, which is not the case, I don't. I still get it wrong a lot. But I would like to think that I have at least gotten a little bit better at that discernment and been able to be more effective, because I know where I am needed, and where what is needed from me is my voice or my resources or my support and uplifting. And have been Souls taught me how to get better at figuring out where to apply the different things that I have available to me. Whereas prior to Souls, I thought that I needed to be the one who was going to completely fix everything, and that it was rooted in a whole lot of things that I had to unlearn while I was at Souls. And I was grateful to have faculty and mentors who, could push me to unlearn that, and did it in a very caring and supportive way, and gave me a lot of space in the 5 years I was in the program to practice.
As someone, me, for example, who is navigating the DEI journey, and who I feel like I'm still in the beginning stages. Things are constantly evolving, constantly changing. I am very grateful to you for sharing how you, who has a degree, a PhD in leadership studies, who trains in diversity, equity, inclusion, who has worked across multiple institutions, you said that you still have a whiteboard where you have, visual representations of the things that you've learned, and you're tracking where you are. So even if you have a PhD, everything is still evolving. There is still room to grow. And when you said, even you make mistakes, and I think that is the most relatable piece for us, is no matter where you are in your journey, there is still room to grow, and there is still room to grow from and learn from mistakes. So I really thank you for sharing that. It's comforting to know that we are among people who are willing to grow and admit those things together. As part of this DEI series, it's a 3-part series for those of you who are in the audience. Today is part 1. And the idea for today's conversation is to really get an understanding of what DEI means. You may hear DEI, DEI, DEIA, JEDI, EDI, D&I. There's just so many different ways of talking about it. And it varies from, higher education to for-profit, nonprofit, wherever you are. So I would love for you to, tell us more about what DEI is in your sphere. What else have you seen? And how can we start to distinguish and know, what's on the horizon?
Certainly. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of things that sort of shape and change this. And without sort of pulling out my notes from my history of higher education class, I'll try to see what I can, how I can synthesize this a little bit more quickly, because I don't have 15 weeks to go through all of it like I used to. So in the 90s and previous to the 90s, so in the 80s and 90s, there was the diversity conversation. And that sort of goes back even to the late 1960s and the 1970s, when, the first ethnic studies programs and the first multicultural and diversity services and student of color services were being established at universities. Also, since I've spent my entire career in higher education, that is like most of the context that I sort of draw a lot of my insights from. I know, aside from a couple of gigs working fast food and in restaurants as a teenager, I know very little about the for-profit world. So diversity and, its focus on sort of who is here and who is not here was a large part of that history. And as insights about it, as knowledge about it, as learning about it continued to happen, folks started to ask questions about whether or not that was the end point. Is it really just about numbers? And folks started to note that even as numbers increased, if there were more students of identities that had previously not been represented at a particular institution or across higher education in the United States and across the world, as the demographics started to shift, that didn't necessarily impact outcomes. And so then there started to be further questions about, well, is it really just a question about diversifying the student body? Is it also about diversifying the staff and the faculty? And is it about creating a campus environment that sort of accesses things that are beyond the question of diversity? And so that is where a lot of the language for inclusion, equity, and justice started to enter. And at different points in time, different words have been used, or different combinations of words have been used. The current three that tend to pop up the most, or that tend to be used the most, is diversity, equity, and inclusion in some order, because some places it's equity, diversity, and inclusion. Some places it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some places diversity, inclusion, equity. Though I have started to see, and most of the places that I have seen using it have been public institutions in California have been using JEDI, so Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or JEDI. I don't know a ton of like where that came from, but I am at an institution that uses it, and I appreciate it because it puts justice sort of at the front of things. And at least sort of my experience with it at my current institution has been that it reframes the conversation about the interaction of these three things, which is also part of why I think using sort of more than just one letter is helpful across all institutions or organizations. So if it's just a conversation of diversity, but we say, this is a DEI initiative, it needs to prompt folks to ask questions about like, okay, so if we are focusing on diversity, sort of how does that lead us to questions of inclusion? How does that lead us to questions of equity? In my organization, in my university, that also prompts us to constantly ask, so how is this also a justice initiative? Are we doing more than just seeking diversity? are we also working towards justice? And not that every sort of piece of paper needs to be the solution to hundreds and hundreds of years of historical inequity that we are going to fix with this one policy or this one practice. But we get to constantly ask the question, does this move us in the direction of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? Are those things working together? And are the decisions that we are making in service of all of those things? Do they advance us towards our goals? Do they put our values into sort of more clarified practice? I think you had also asked something about the distinction of them. Am I remembering that correctly?
Should we see them as being synonymous with each other?
So I think, and my thinking is informed by somebody who is much smarter than me, so I will give them full credit. My thinking on the matter is really, I draw from Dr. D.L. Stewart, who is the chair of the higher education program at the University of Denver. In 2017, he wrote a piece for Inside Higher Education, talking about the need for a language shift in higher education. And since this piece has come out, I probably don't go at least a week without referencing it to someone and emailing it to someone or having it pulled up on my desktop. So it pretty much is a permanent fixture in my world at this point. So the way that he framed it is that diversity asks questions about numbers. So who is in the room? How many people have we admitted, hired, et cetera? Inclusion asks whose ideas are and aren't being listened to. Equity asks questions about who is trying to get in the room but is facing barriers to their inclusion or access in the room. And justice asks questions about whose ideas won't be taken seriously even if they are in the room, or what conditions have been created that folks' humanity is seen at different levels. And so those are all interrelated to one another. You know, certainly there are conversations that we need to have about access, about numbers, about, you know, admissions, about hiring practices that are diversity questions. And those initiatives, sort of as I was speaking to a moment ago, you know, just changing the numbers won't necessarily create equitable access to resources. It won't change institutional culture. It won't sort of address long entrenched systemic barriers to things like safety, to resources for longer life chances, to quote the language from law professor Dean Spade from Seattle University. He talks a lot about how like questions of equity and justice really are about ensuring longer life chances for people. And you know, when we really sort of talk about access to resources, when we talk about equitable outcomes, when we talk not just about people sort of being included in particular spaces, but being able to thrive within an organization, those are conversations of equity and justice. And so that is sort of how I often think about them, as being distinct and unique concepts that also have to be in relationship to one another. And so, as I had mentioned again a moment ago, so when I am doing my work and when I'm talking with folks about their policies and practices, a lot of the questions that I ask are, you know, what is it that we are trying to address with this, and what is its relationship to these other concepts? Because you know, strategic planning to sort of shift the diversity of an organization is an important thing. And if we're going to bring a bunch of folks in, we should probably make it so that not just that they get here, but that they can thrive, that they can be successful, and that they want to stay, which sort of, again, a thing that I draw on quite a bit from my experience at USD. In 2015, I went with Dr. Christopher Newman on our international trip to Brazil. And we visited a campus in which the students had gone on strike. So we got to the university and there was no one there because there were no students, so classes weren't running, and the students had Some of them had painted on the walls their picket signs, and others had attached picket signs to the walls, sort of to maintain the protest in their absence. And my Portuguese is not very good, but I was able to discern enough of what a sign was saying to really sort of carry it with me. And again, this is 7 years ago, and I still think about this pretty much every day. There was a sign that was taped to the wall, and I was able to figure enough of the Portuguese out to discern that it said, "I don't just want to get in, I want to stay." And I think that student who I've never met has shaped so much of how I think about and engage with these concepts, because I want people to get in, and I want the conditions to mean that getting in is just the first part of their journey, that they can thrive, that they can be successful, that they can be safe, that they can be secure, and that they can live the life that they want to live within sort of the institution, whatever that may be. And so that's where I think the interrelatedness of these concepts is important, and that it's important to understand the distinctions and differences so that we can articulate their interrelatedness.
Absolutely. That was a very powerful memory that you shared about your time in Brazil. And I think that also speaks to the importance of including the right community in the conversations. And, had just the staff and administration assumed what the issue was, they may have been way off base. But by, making time to hear from the students, what is their challenge, what is their experience, and that can be applied across any sector. Talk to your constituencies. What is it that they're seeing or believing or would like to see? And it definitely speaks back to what you mentioned about your time at Souls, the presence and the reflect and the make time to strategically plan for things, not just move forward and incorporate a bunch of things that may not be ready to work in that moment. If it's not too much trouble, I would love to have you reread what you said, kind of the definition descriptions of what diversity, equity, inclusion mean, because in my years of working in DEI, I've never heard such good, concise little things to frame it around. So I'd love for the audience to hear that again.
Absolutely. So I'm going to read directly from the article, again, because it has a permanent place on my desktop. I've always got it at the ready. So the bullet point, and I'll also send you all the link to it so that folks can share it sort of through the alumni network. So the way that Dr. Stewart wrote it is: diversity asks who's in the room. Equity responds who is trying to get in the room but can't, whose presence in the room is under threat of erasure. Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority in this space. He goes on, diversity asks, how many more of pick group do we have this year than last year? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority? Inclusion asks, is the environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? And justice responds, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to feel comfortable in maintaining their dehumanizing views? And the article sort of has several more bullet points about the sort of conversation among these different concepts, but those are sort of the first few, and those are ones that I draw from quite often about how to understand sort of the relationship among these things and how to have them be in conversation with one another.
Thank you. Thank you for rereading that and sharing that with the audience again. For this particular session, DEI+A. Accessibility. Can you dive in a little bit more into how this adds an added element for the scope of work?
Absolutely. And again, I think, this is something that was offered by a great colleague of mine who the folks will be able to get to hear from later this week, Dr. Nick Franco. They had talked about the use of this, which isn't a thing that I had come across and has sparked a lot of my own sort of reflection on the need to ask questions about accessibility and the need for accessibility to be a part of justice practices. And again, I think it returns to some of those questions. You know, if our efforts are not made accessible, if our campuses aren't accessible, if our organizations aren't accessible to folks across a wide variety of needs, some of which are physical, some of which are cognitive, some of which involve the interaction of cognitive and physical engagement, is it really justice? And, you know, so disability justice, access justice, and I think quite wonderfully the work of activist Mia Mingus, who talks about it as the need for access intimacy, or, you know, sort of like a caring and compassionate relationship to folks that involves an understanding of what their needs are for engagement, and not meeting those needs simply out of sort of, well, like we have to do this because we won't get sued. So not having it be sort of a question of compliance, but a question of care, a question of the sort of meaningful relationships that are built within organizations and within communities. That is an incredibly important part of creating more just sort of organizations and creating the kind of society that Dr. Stewart is talking about in his piece, you know, one in which people sort of experience safety as part of care, as part of, you know, the organization being designed with them in mind. And so, you know, that is sort of how I think quite a lot about access and accessibility, and also have to, you know, it is also a place where I recognize that a lot of my learning still needs to happen, because it is not, because I can even acknowledge in my learning that it has not always been a part of the conversation. And so as somebody who is now charged with creating these initiatives, you know, I have to constantly be checking myself to make sure that, you know, just because it isn't something that I need doesn't mean that I'm leaving it out of how I'm preparing things, how I'm thinking about offering and creating opportunities and services to meet the needs of the staff that I have to serve. And so, you know, I think that is an important part of this work too, and that there's a need for constant learning, that the learning needs to be sort of a part of everyday practices. And so, you know, part of why I keep a lot of things sort of at the ready is because I know that I'm constantly needing to learn and relearn, and I'm constantly having to sort of challenge myself on the ways that what I'm doing still isn't yet there. That it's, you know, I don't necessarily try to get into the debate even internally about whether it's good enough, but I do try to be honest with myself about the ways that I still have not gotten there yet, that there's still work to do, that, you know, what I'm doing might be good and it's still not yet sufficient. It is still, you know, there's still more to do. And I think that that is both a really important part of being accountable and also sort of maintaining this commitment, is that there's still more work to do. And, you know, I'm trying to remember where someone said it, because again, like, it's something that I think about quite often, but it was, you know, like, do as much as you can today, try to do a little bit better tomorrow. And you know, that is sort of, it's a mantra that I carry with me pretty regularly, is, you know, like, I want to do as much as I can today, and tomorrow I'm going to try to do a little bit better.
And I'm definitely taking away there's still more work to be done. And you may be doing well now, but yes, and there is more work to be done. And
Absolutely.
That can seem overwhelming, absolutely. But the way that mantra is a little bit now, a little bit more tomorrow. And there is a whole audience here who is interested and invested. And if everybody has that, you know, inspiration, that motivation, together we can accomplish great things. You were speaking about learning, and this conversation really brings up notions of social justice and inclusion, and the notion of privilege and oppression. How do you help folks navigate learning about their identities, how those identities experience privilege and oppression, and support their continued growth?
In some ways, I feel like that is a big piece of what I do. And in some ways, I feel sort of still wholly unqualified. I try to I think quite a lot about something that my partner, who is the best student affairs professional that I've ever met, and who is also one of the most brilliant people I've ever encountered. And so I'm grateful that I get to sort of be in community with her every day. She says, this work is about planting seeds. And so, not every seed sprouts right away. Some seeds need a day of tending, some need a season of tending. And that it is about putting in the work that's needed at the moment to tend to sort of create the conditions for what needs to grow. And so, I try to create as many opportunities as I can for things to take root. I try to meet people sort of where they are. So again, sort of not just applying the same set of practices to everything and expecting them to work, because different soils, to sort of really follow this metaphor through, different soils, different climates, different conditions, different weather patterns sort of impact growth. So try to pay attention to, what the needs are of the particular situation of the people in front of me, where are they starting the conversation from, and what is needed in order to sort of tend that learning. And I think one of the other things that I find very helpful and that I think about quite a lot is that it is not just sort of about me imparting ideas or information, although that might be some component of it, but it is also that people need to be engaged in the work that they want to do. So people who are doing this learning also need to be a part of the conversation, and I think can also create opportunities for their own conversations, so that it's not just have a conversation with Connor and everything's going to be all good after that, but maybe it starts with a conversation with me, and it leads to a conversation after they leave the room. It leads to a conversation with their supervisor. It leads to a conversation with their supervisees. It leads to sort of redesigning an evaluation or a feedback process. It leads to a different way of engaging with students. It leads to some redesigning of policies and practices. And I might not be present for most of that, but I encourage folks to sort of take the work with them and continue the conversations. And they can always come back to me. When I was a faculty member at Souls, when I was a graduate student at Souls, I'm still in touch with many of the people who supervised me and who I supervised, who I taught, who taught me, because these conversations are ongoing and the learning needs constant attention in order to happen, in order to thrive, in order to be sustained. And so I would say, come to things like this and connect with folks, from your alumni network, connect with folks who were in your classes, talk to them, because doing this work alone also is a lot harder than doing it in community. I think this work is really sort of done best when it is in community with people. And so look for the spaces of community where that can happen. Who are the people, ask yourself, who are the people in your life that you want to have these conversations with, and see about having them. I'm very, 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 very lucky to have lots of people in my life that I can talk to about this on a regular basis, and that we go.
Connor, did I lose you? Give us 1 second.
Hello, I thought I'd pop back in while we wait for Connor to reconnect. What a great session. Amanda, I know that you are doing some of this work as well. And Connor, do we have you back?
Just on mute.
I believe I am back.
You're
I
back.
apologize for that. I really have no idea what happened.
This is the pros and cons of technology, yeah? All right, I'll take my
Right.
leave and let you guys continue. And we have just an FYI about 12 minutes left. So if there's an opportunity to answer some of the questions posed by the audience, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. Well, I will take that interruption as a great cue for me to stop talking. At least, about like, I think I was probably at the end of what needed to be said there, rather than try to rehash the entirety of my answer, because I also don't remember where I got cut off.
And that's the authenticity of the conversation that we're having. It's not rehearsed. It's really just an opportunity to grow with somebody in a safe space like this, in a safe environment where you can build that community, where you can ask questions, where you can learn from each other, not necessarily to learn and have a fix and end all be all, but to start that conversation and to look for resources. And I think that's exactly what you were getting at. What are some of the ways that the USD alumni community and just USD community in general can do on their own to advance this? And you nailed it. You said, this DEI series, which is every Wednesday in April, is one great opportunity. Get to know the audience, your peers, utilize the university as a resource for these conversations. So Connor, thank you so much. This has been phenomenal. I would love to get some of the questions in the Q&A, so we'll kind of quickly go through those and hopefully we can answer as many as possible. Let me pull them up on my screen. All right, this work/space is very meaningful, but can be heavy. How do you take care of yourself?
Try to remember to eat. I try to remember to give myself sort of time and space to breathe. I'm an extrovert by sort of wiring. So being around people is always going to be preferable to me, or at least like I'm always going to want to stay in the conversation and the engagement in that way. So I have to remember to sort of take time to breathe, take time to sort of process, take time to reflect, give myself some interior time. Just as a way to kind of balance my energy and also to go through the necessary parts of thinking and reflecting and things of that sort. Because if I am in conversations with people for 8 straight hours, like they might all be wonderful and I won't remember most of it. So I need to sort of do something and then take time to process it and make meaning of it and, then go into something else. And so those are some of the things that I've tried to do is sort of, and that I try to time in tandem. So, okay, like I'm going to sit down and I'm going to have a cup of coffee and I'm going to reflect on, what just happened. I'm going to prep myself a meal and use that meal time to sort of like get back in touch and recenter before going into the next thing. Or if I've been sort of sitting by myself and reading, which I find to be phenomenally exhausting, reading just like takes everything out of me. Okay, let me talk to someone about what I just read. Let me call up a friend and say, hey, I just read this thing. Can I send it to you? And can we make some time to chat about it over coffee or something like that? So just trying to sort of find a better balance to my energy and find ways to sort of make meaning of the things that I'm doing without sort of overloading on one particular sort of energy is some of how I've found myself to be able to find a little bit of balance and to sort of not get as sort of worn out by how heavy a lot of this can be.
And I think that's definitely advice all of us can take. One question that I can ask, and I think we can answer, is can you provide the alumni staff with the links to the articles that you mentioned so that we can provide them to the audience?
Yes, I absolutely will. I've got on one of my other screens, I've got a list of the things that I have mentioned that I intend to send to in an email to you all.
Perfect. And then I'm not sure if you can answer this specifically, but what are some ways that hiring managers can de-bias the hiring process? Any best practices you can share from your experience?
I'm going to give what's going to seem like a very stock answer, but especially for folks in USD, please check out the HERC, the Higher Education Recruitment Consortium, which I believe USD is a member of. And if not, you might want to look into that. They have a lot of really phenomenal resources about about working to build hiring committees and to doing sort of bias intervention training within hiring processes. It's a really phenomenal resource, and they have already designed a lot of very helpful and effective trainings that can be really great places to start. I also think for folks in hiring manager positions, some of it is, taking time to ask yourself some really difficult, I'll acknowledge, questions about, what are some of the ways in which our processes and practices, I almost sort of mash those two words together, might not have been the best iteration of our values. What ways have we contributed to some of this stuff in the past? Because until we sort of have those honest internal conversations, both internal to ourselves and internal within our organization, we're not going to be able to identify where the work needs to change, where new things need to happen. And so some of that is really sitting with what some of the hard feedback might need to be about how we were not our best selves, and use that as a jumping off point for, okay, so if this is where we were not the people, not the organization that we want to be, what do we need to change in order to do that? So some of it is doing this sort of personal reflection, personal assessment and evaluation, and also sort of looking into resources that lots of folks have created and lots of folks have sort of established themselves as experts in developing, that are specifically designed to do these things, to do the kinds of things that folks, want to do in the day-to-day practice of doing things like hiring. Yeah.
Thank you, Connor. This has been an amazing conversation and really just an eye-opening opportunity. And like mentioned before, the beginning of conversations, and really in hopes to set the tone for the audience so that we can grow in this work together and continue to build off of today's knowledge with the rest of the sessions and continue that work throughout. So I thank you very much for joining us.